So welcome to this evening. Let me just say a word or two about what this evening's all about. This is really the culmination tonight of a semester-long project that a bunch of us have been engaged in here at, well, actually not just at OU, but across the country in certain ways. A bunch of us are part of a blog called Inhabiting the Anthropocene, and one of the things that we do on this blog is look at articles that are published that are relevant to our topic and give them a real close read and sort of try to present to the world our understanding of these articles. And so we decided to work on a recent article by our guest tonight, Dr. Earl Ellis, who has written a piece called Ecology in an Anthropogenic Biosphere. It came out last summer in Ecological Monographs. And it's a really astoundingly rich, complicated, and I think groundbreaking piece. So we thought, well, this is something that we can really sink our teeth in, and that we would spend a good, 10 or 11 weeks with a bunch of us sort of thinking hard about it and taking a look at it from our own particular point of view. And we thought, well, since we're going to do all that work, why don't we see about having Earl come on out and actually talk to us afterwards about it. And we thought, well, as long as he's here, why don't we have him talk to the campus and the community? And so that's what this evening is really all about. So I want to welcome you and thank you for coming, and just give you a sense of this evening as really the culmination of a long series of events. It's something that would not have been possible without a lot of support, and I want to thank, first of all, the OU Humanities Forum, led by Janet Ward, our esteemed colleague over here, and ably assisted by Stephanie Bates, who's in the back, who have done just amazing amounts of work to make this happen. So thank you very, very, very much for the support for this. The Humanities Forum is supported by all kinds of groups around campus, including the Provost's Office and the VPR. But there's some extra support for this particular program that I want to acknowledge. First of all, the Office of the President, which has helped in bringing Earl out here and hosting him so graciously. Also, a couple of departments on campus. My own department of philosophy has contributed. The Biological Survey has contributed, and also the Department of Geology. So I want to thank all of them. Okay, with that, let me invite Earl Ellis up to the stage. Earl Ellis is a professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and a quite noted scholar of the Anthropocene, the early version of the Anthropocene, I guess it's fair to say, and he's going to be talking about his ideas on the anthropogenic biosphere. Let me pull up his presentation. There we go.
All right, thank you all for coming out on such a beautiful day. I think I would be outside if I could be this moment. But thank you very much, Zev, for organizing all this. It's really an honor to be here and to have so many people weigh in on your ideas. It's, of course, also very terrifying, but very valuable. And the folks who have already done this by blogging have taught me a lot already. And I look forward to engaging in a kind of a longer-term discussion about some of this work. With the talk I'm going to give today is going to be very brief, and the goal is to just give kind of really the core of this new theory, explaining why humans and no other multicellular species in the history of the Earth has emerged as a global force that is changing the way the Earth functions. That is really a novel fact, and it's something that challenges and in some ways changes the classic story that the natural sciences have told about the human role in the Earth since the beginning of the Enlightenment, which has been a progressive story about this hairless ape who is basically just one among many apes on a planet revolving around a sun that's just one of many stars in a universe that is very, very much more complicated and much more significant than anything that could possibly be happening on this little planet. Essentially, humans have been kind of downgraded as in their importance in the way things work. And one important concept of the Anthropocene and this theory is a way of understanding the actual fact that humans have become consequential. We actually are changing an entire planet. This planet, we're not insignificant on this planet. We are actually very significant on this planet. So the Anthropocene, I'm going to assume that everybody in here has heard this term many times, and I'm also going to assume that most of you have seen this image many times. So this is the Earth glowing at night. So the Anthropocene, this idea that humans have emerged as a global force that is transforming the Earth, is an idea that's been discussed a lot. And I use this image, even though everyone's seen it a million times, because it really does get at the core idea of this theory, which is coming out of an ecology, biology background, natural sciences background, with a simple question of, can you explain this new property of the Earth, that it now glows at night? Can you explain this using biology? Can the biological properties of Homo sapiens sapiens explain this phenomenon? And I think it's very, very obvious that it cannot, right? We don't actually glow at night. It's not just that there's a lot of people on Earth that suddenly the Earth starts to glow, right? It's this emergent social property of all of us interacting together at very large scales over many generations, building physical infrastructure to make this happen, to make the Earth glow at night, right? So it's all of us interacting together. It's the emergent property of all of our interactions that has produced this global force. It is not a simple biological thing. And I think we're also all familiar with the fact that one of the greatest global changes that we've made on Earth in recent times is certainly the mass combustion of fossil fuels that is driving rapid global climate change. And that is a sort of a crisis, right? We don't know where we're going with this, and the consequences are also somewhat unknown, but they're certainly going to change the planet very significantly. Even if we do something substantial to change this, it's going to be a big effect. Hopefully it will not ultimately be the biggest effect we've ever had. But the idea that this is the only way to look at human transformation of the way the Earth functions is really incorrect. If you look further back in time, you can find other very major consequential effects of humanity, even before the last ice age, more than 10,000 years ago, almost 20,000 years ago in many cases, when behaviorally modern Homo sapiens spread to other continents. This was followed by extinctions of megafauna, the large carnivores and herbivores on many continents that had big effects on ecology. It's not just the fact that these species were driven extinct, but actually when these species are driven extinct, you see mass recoveries of forests, for example. You see cascading effects on ecology that are very significant as a result of this. And that's thousands of years ago. And in fact, if you look more closely, you will see lots of different transformative effects that go way back in time, thousands of years ago, the origins of agriculture, domestication, clearing of forests, and the effects on the Earth happen early. So there's lots of different time periods. There's lots of whens human become a significant global force. But for me, the most interesting big question is, why isn't the classic patterns of the global biosphere, the terrestrial biosphere at least, why are these classic patterns no longer necessarily the dominant patterns that you'll see? And if you go outside here, right, it's not so common to see. I think it's tall grass prairie here or short grass prairie. This is not so common to see anymore. Why not? Well, people like trees, for example, and so they bring trees to the prairie. In other places, they cut the trees down. These classic patterns of the biomes have been transformed. And a while ago, about 2008 or so, I did a global analysis with a colleague where we looked at these global patterns of ecology shaped by the human climate, not the natural patterns that evolved under the hot and dry conditions that produce deserts or the moist, warm conditions that produce a tropical rainforest, but the conditions of human societies that have reshaped the ecology of the planet. And if you look here, you'll see we're either in rangelands or croplands, something like that. These kinds of properties now have restructured a large amount of the terrestrial biosphere, about 3/4. And I was asked, so this is just empirical work. We just use remote sensing and census data and this sort of thing to look at these global patterns. But when, in fact, I was asked, so why? Why do we have this transformative effect? And that's where this work comes from, is an attempt to look at why do humans emerge as a global force, in a sense as this new climate system, a new human climate system that is reshaping the biosphere. Why do we emerge as this global force? And the theory behind that I developed, which is based on many other theories that I'll try to weave together for you to explain, is this idea of sociocultural niche construction, which is certainly a very fancy terminology that, like I said, I hope I can explain it by bringing it up from the roots of the other theories it's built on. But this is this idea of how we have become a global climate of its own. And then we'll talk about how those processes of socioculture niche construction, the way we change environments, has changed over time and how that has actually changed the planet. And at the end, I'll talk some about what are the implications of this for what can be done, what should be done, what are the possibilities in the Anthropocene. Here's a classic model of how evolution and biological change works. Very simple. You can see the genetic inheritance over here. This is the idea that life evolves, right? The changes in the biosphere that we see, different types of organism emerging, are essentially shaped by the forces of the natural environment. So let's just think about the species that are adapted to the climate of a given time or adapted to live on certain soils, right? The idea here, you can see the arrow of influence is one way. Organisms have to adapt through evolutionary processes, natural selection, acting on their genes, their genetic inheritance. That is what determines evolution over time, the interactions there. So it's a one-way street. But ecologists are increasingly aware that that's not enough to capture an understanding of how these processes actually unfold. And I guess we're getting a little bit of text stuff going on. But anyway, that's the concept, first, of ecosystem engineering, that a lot of organisms systematically alter their environments. And the beaver is a classic example, right, with its transformative construction of dams. And when this alteration of the environment changes the adaptive fitness of an organism, when it actually gives them some advantages or disadvantages, it could harm them as well, when these alterations have evolutionary consequences, then this is called an ecological inheritance. So you have genetic inheritance coming from that adaptation to the environment. Well, when you alter the environment and you must adapt to the consequences of that alteration, that's ecological inheritance. So that makes this very simple model a two-way street, right? Organisms can alter the environment and then must adapt to those altered environments. That's the concept of niche construction. So now you've got part of that terminology in the socioculture niche construction model is this idea of niche construction. And that's become more or less a mainstream part of ecology in very recent years. Another aspect of biology, just classic biology, that is now becoming more and more significant is the idea of cultural inheritance through social learning. And again, this is not something that requires a human being. There's lots of organisms that do this. And for example, the white-crowned sparrow must learn its mating songs from others in its environment in order to reproduce. It needs to learn these songs. It's a social learning with a very powerful adaptive fitness consequence, the ability to reproduce. That's called a cultural inheritance, okay, when you have a socially learned trait that has effects on adaptive fitness. And when you put these two together with some of the classic models of inheritance, you have a new theory about how inheritances work, how evolution works, this idea of the extended evolutionary synthesis. And essentially the classic view of evolution that is used right now, the modern synthesis, is all just on the left there with genetic inheritances. Okay, and that's the basic idea, right? Inheritances go from parents to progeny, right? The genetic inheritance. You notice that even on the genetic inheritance, this new model, the extended evolutionary synthesis, also includes some of these horizontal arrows. It turns out a lot of organisms, especially microbes, can actually move DNA across individuals. You put different bacteria into a test tube, and they can inherit horizontally. And of course, you can also have inheritance obliquely from the older generation to the younger generation. That's that angled arrow. And that's also very important because if you don't have any amount of vertical, you can't actually inherit things over the long term. Okay, so that's one level of extension, is just these different ways that inheritance can work. And then finally, you notice you've got a whole bunch of inheritances over there that are added on. Epigenetic inheritance is a more recent discovery, this idea of gene modification, methylation for those of you who are familiar with it, in which during the lifetime of an organism, it can actually inherit different modifications of the activity of the genes that can be passed on. So that's another complexity of inheritance. But on the far right there, you see the two forms of inheritance that we just talked about, ecological inheritance and cultural inheritance. So when you're trying to understand what makes the adaptive fitness or the behaviors of an organism, you need to consider all of these types of inheritances, especially when you're thinking about humans. Another fundamental concept here is sociality. All right, and sociality is certainly something that emerged long, long before humans did. And there's plenty of social creatures all around us, probably undermining this building as we speak. We have social insects, for example. And so there's a lot of advantages to having a social lifestyle in which the actual group can do a lot more than you could have individually. And in this case, you're also looking at social ecosystem engineers, right? They're building these nests. They have also ecological inheritance, right? They require these built structures. So that's all something that exists without humans. What humans add to this is an extreme capacity, a very exceptional capacity for social learning. And it's so extreme that it produces what is considered to be one of the most distinctive features of humans in cultural evolution is cumulative culture, the ability for culture to accumulate and accumulate and accumulate over time. The other species that do social learning, very few of them can accumulate culture over long periods of time and accumulate more and more social learning. And finally, how this all comes together in the truly exceptional trait of behaviorally modern humans is this idea of ultrasociality. So for all the social insects and social animals of the world, their sociality is generally conditioned by their biological behaviors. Their genetic traits determine the relationships that they have with each other. Behaviorally modern humans have social relationships that are determined by culture. They're learned. You cannot actually say, how do humans relate to each other? Right? Every kind of way you can imagine. There's so many different societies with so many different ways of interacting together. It's because they're socially learned traits. So the organization of human societies is socially learned and evolves through cultural evolution. So that's a very important difference. That's ultrasociality. Non-kin subsistence exchange is also very important. In most social organisms, the exchange of the sustenance, food, other necessities, wants, and needs is among related individuals. So there's essentially a biological reason why they're exchanging this. They're essentially exchanging among their their close relatives. So they're going through a kind of a classic evolutionary process. But humans do a huge amount of exchange with non-kin. And that is actually very unusual in the biological world. And non-kin subsistence exchange takes many forms, but you will see it all over the place. And you'll see this in early societies, and you'll see it today. So the classic concept of sociocultural niche construction is based on this idea that humans construct their niche through social activities that are socially learned in societies whose organization and strategies for ecosystem engineering, for changing the environment to make it more productive for them, are also socially learned. Right? So societies are doing this very dramatic ecosystem engineering through social processes. And again, this continues today, and this is just another example of non-kin subsistence exchange. These relationships are constantly changing, and they're fundamental, and they're present in all societies. And it enables essentially everyone in this room to gain their subsistence without requiring you to go farm or hunt animals or anything like that. That's a pretty remarkable thing that we can do that. When we put this all together into a new model, you can see the classic one that we had on the bottom there that's got the two-way street with niche construction. We're adding in the cultural inheritances of societies, and I've added in one more that's not really so important for the discussion today, but this idea of material inheritance, which are things like this building that have been built by other people and that you can use and provide some benefits, maybe some disadvantages as well, to those who live today. So that alteration of the environment by building artificial structures is also a kind of inheritance that can influence things. Now, why are humans changing the world so much? So we've got this pretty novel species that's able to have this socially learned social organization. Why is that so consequential? Well, one of the fundamental reasons is that social evolution is much faster, and the evolution of culture is much faster than genetics. Now, there's examples where that's not true. For example, some of the early stone tool techniques did not evolve even as fast as genetics evolved with early humans. When I say early, I mean millions of years ago. But in more recent times, and Darwin himself was very aware of this, culture can evolve faster is kind of a basic principle about culture. And one of the obvious reasons is, of course, horizontal and oblique inheritance. Right? We can exchange culture immediately, in real time. And in fact, with the internet, right? Real-time exchange with almost anybody. But even without that, just through language and other techniques, we can easily move a trait like how to tweet, and that's, of course, going to improve your reproductive success. We can learn that very quickly horizontally. We don't have to wait for our parents to leave that to the next generation. Another important effect is what's called the ratchet effect, and the simplest way to think of that is we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Right? Once the wheel has been invented, you can add that on to other types of technologies, for example, and you don't need to reinvent it. So for that reason, cultural inheritance has become more and more powerful over time. Instead of just taking one little thing, you can put together lots of bundles of things, and that ratchets up the power of cultural inheritance very rapidly over time. And the final one is the one that really gets us into trouble, is this runaway cultural niche construction. And that's the idea is, once you're in this process of cooperative ecosystem engineering, large groups of people altering the environment with big cultural effects that you need to adapt to. For example, humans are learning to till the soil to increase productivity, but then the soil starts to give out. And then you have to adapt to that by even more sophisticated techniques over time. And so you're essentially adapting to culture with more culture. And that's a runaway effect, right? When you do something and then the only way to survive that is to add even more on top of that, you get into this cycle of just constantly ratcheting up and running away in your cultural and environmental modifications. So two different ways to look at the long-term changes in these anthroecosystems, these systems changing over time. One is very simple, and it's the same for biological evolution, more or less. We have gradual accumulation of inheritances. So down below you see cultural inheritances are accumulating and evolving just kind of gradually on the bottom there. But there's also these regime shifts where several different forms of inheritance all might change together in a pretty powerful way. For example, the origins of agriculture might change the way that social organization works, right? So that all these things would change together, and it's a very big change. And just for some, these are the kind of the really huge examples. These are what I might call the meta regime shifts in human societies over the very long term. And this is just to look at the grand patterns of these changes. You get very big shifts depending on combinations of techniques and cultural attributes, like the origins of essentially behaviorally modern humans is kind of the beginning of this curve here. With we clearly have languages, we have trade, we have symbolic behaviors. These are all setting things in motion. You have some material inheritances that are going along with that, ornaments and ceramics, projectiles, and changes in the environment that come from that through more advanced techniques for altering the environment. And you see, over time, sociocultural niche construction becomes a more important process in determining the adaptive fitness of individuals and cultures. Genetic inheritance kind of goes down, and it's there, but it's not the dominant form. And you see increasing importance of cultural inheritance and material inheritance and so forth. So that's kind of a very general big picture. But it's very important to realize that with that chart, it makes it look like everything kind of just goes and gets bigger and bigger. Every society might start small, and just suddenly, over time, you end up with a modern industrial society. It didn't happen that way. It's an evolutionary theory. So think about how you end up with humans. It's a very complicated path. It's not a direct path. It's a very complex path. And you have most of the societal types that you've ever had are still around. You still have hunter-gatherer societies of all different kinds. You still have a lot of different agrarian societies. So it's not as simple as just there's this kind of linear progression with one replacing the other at all. In some ways, what happens is you just get more complexity. And the idea that cultural evolution and social groups and all this have just kind of, that was something for the past, all that kind of cultural evolution. It's not true. It's constantly going on even today. Some of the general trends that we see are, now this is where we're getting into an explanation of kind of, first we're saying, why are there so many different social, environmental relationships? Why are there so many cultures? And why are there so many different ways of altering the environment? But here we're looking at some of the general trends over the long term that have enabled really large-scale societies to emerge. Societies that are capable of actually forcing the earth to change. And so the first one is just societal upscaling trends. So there's a trend toward larger and larger scales of society, right? Now, it's not to say that every society becomes larger and larger, but you see larger and larger societies recently, Okay, they're large in many ways. They're more complex, they're more specialized, they're more dense, they use more energy. Another general trend we see is increases in cooperative ecosystem engineering. The scale at which humans interact to alter the environment is also changing and getting more sophisticated. Land use intensification is another general trend you see, which is essentially societies are using land and other scarce resources more efficiently over time as they become scarce, which is very different than the classic model that you're probably familiar with of Malthus, in which essentially human societies don't change and they just ramp up into limits. That's not what you see. You actually see intensification. And the last one is also another one that's gotten us into some trouble, energy substitution. Rather than just relying on human biological energy to do everything, we are harnessing other sources of energy over time. And it might start very early with using other species and fire as our sources of energy, but now of course we use fossil fuels, nuclear, solar, all different kinds of energy are possible. The concept of land use intensification is very common when we talk about long-term trends in agricultural land use. And that's even true today. We have increasing intensification of land use, increasingly efficient land use now. But this begins before you have agriculture. Hunter-gatherers develop lots of advanced cultural capacities to increase the amount of harvestable energy and nutrition from a given amount of land. And one of the classics is dietary broadening, which, for example, when a group drives a species extinct, like the woolly mammoth, you are no longer the woolly mammoth people. You have to start eating other species. And agricultural middens of societies, which are just the heaps of trash, essentially. You can see this over time as societies start to use more and more different species. They gain the capacity to do this, and so they can eat almost everything. That enables you to have more from the same land. Food processing is one that just seems kind of trivial, but in fact it's responsible for the reality that most of our food energy right now comes from grains. And those cereals are not actually capable of being consumed in any useful way without harvesting large amounts of them and processing them, roasting them, and this sort of thing. They're not edible just because you gather a few of them. So that's an important emergent development too. And the burning of woodlands and grasslands by hunter-gatherers to improve their productivity and the ability to hunt successfully in them is also a well-known practice. I think it was done here in this area. It's done pretty much wherever you have hunter-gatherers. So you go from this kind of, and this is actually an early form of agriculture. Obviously, it's not early agriculture. It's recent agriculture. But this form of clearing land this way is what you do. It's a smart thing to do if you have basically unlimited amounts of land. You're not worried about how much land you have. And this is a very labor-efficient way to produce your food. But over time, land becomes more scarce and more advanced technologies come into play to enable higher levels of production over time. And you see this long-term general trend of as populations get denser and societies grow and there's essentially a shortage of land, you see this trend toward more and more intensive farming from at one point where you're actually leaving land fallow to regrow and regenerate nutrients for long periods. It becomes shorter and shorter fallows. You're basically using less land per person over time. Now, societies are often growing at the same time, so they're actually using more land overall, but per person, they're using a lot less land. That's land use intensification. Trade is something that goes on a long time before the Romans. It's already established, even with behaviorally modern humans 50,000 years ago, you see long-distance trade. But it does increase over time, and the scales of societies are growing. It doesn't mean that this isn't this story of, oh, well, everything kind of gets easier and easier, and then it's no problem. It's actually a story of having to work harder and harder in many cases, and this is one of the most labor-intensive ways of farming that you can imagine. It actually will break your back, more or less, if you do it your whole life. It's a really tough way of doing it, but the capacity to feed people is really pretty remarkable. You can have very dense populations if you farm this way, but it's certainly not an easy way of doing it. So here at the bottom, you see, coupled with these trends in societal change and ecological change, you also have these couple trends. The top one there, just using more and more energy. There's more substitution of energy and more energy per person. So these are per person trends at the bottom there. And you see at the very right side, you see the fossil fuels coming in, and you see other forms of, new forms of abiotic energy, energy that is not from the biosphere, either now through biomass or from the past through fossil fuel, but actually things that don't rely on the biosphere, like solar energy or nuclear energy, right? They're outside of the biosphere. That's a pretty remarkable thing, that we can harness energy outside the biosphere. And then below there you see ecosystem transformation. So to actually sustain one person who's a hunter-gatherer, you're using a lot of wildlands, basically. You're not converting them very much. You're using a lot. And as you get into the larger scale societies, you're using less land per person. You can see it gets smaller, and we're transforming it more, right? So when you get to the far end over there on the right side, you have a very small amount of land used per person, but that land is completely transformed into croplands and rangelands and cities, right? We're not using much wildland, but we're transforming what we use completely. So over time, we've kind of taken this runaway effect kind of to where we've gotten right now, right? By essentially taking one problem and solving it with a larger problem, we've managed to muddle through and create these amazing long-term trends and essentially change a planet. We've gotten into trouble through this, but it has worked over the long term. And so the big question that comes up next is, so where are we going with this? What should we do now that we're a global force? And over at the right side there, I'm kind of just broadly looking at some trends that some are emerging. I wouldn't say they're the kind of trends that you could say are going to occur across the Earth necessarily, but they're interesting to think about. So one of the fundamental elements of what's going on right now as we speak, one of the big Earth system changes right now is the increasing urbanization of Earth's populations. And even though urbanization is absolutely nothing new, the scale of urbanization, the number of people, the percentage of global societies that are going urban is really unprecedented. And one of the important things to realize is that as people become more concentrated into cities, another global effect is occurring at the same time, and this is the intensification of agriculture. To meet the demands of these wealthy, huge populations that are really producing demands on the whole Earth, the capacity to meet those demands is being met not by small-scale operations, but by very large-scale operations. Increasingly technified, larger-scale operations are producing more and more of the sustenance for the world. The result of that is not as simple as, again, the Malthusian discussion might bring up, where you'd expect to see, well, more people, we have a huge number of people on Earth right now, that you'd see more and more land getting used. In fact, land use, the total amount of land used to feed people is actually kind of leveled off, more or less. And that's because of intensification. Land use is getting more and more intensive. So even though more food is available per person than it was before, we actually are using about the same amount of land. So that's, in a sense, a kind of weird success story. It is enabling some actually remarkable recoveries. And when you get into these larger scale production systems, those systems are not interested in marginal lands. They only want the best land. And so a lot of this marginal land that was produced on, that there was production on at very low yields is now being converted just to either abandon or actually converted into conservation. And of course, you don't see that so much out here in Oklahoma, but that is the norm on the East Coast, for example. And it's even the norm in China. You see it all over the place, these recovering woodlands in places that used to be farmed as a result of intensification. So we have amazing potential. And we now live in the most connected, most capable societies that have ever existed on the Earth. There's a tendency for many people to get very gloomy about this time and think, oh, there's nothing we can do. There's so many people on Earth. Things are so tough for us. Well, in fact, if you look at the statistics, if you look at what we're able to do right now, we have more capacity to actually change the Earth for the better than we ever have. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And probably the bigger question is, where do we actually want to go with this capacity? And that is a big question of what is a we on this Earth. There really isn't necessarily a we, but it's a question. It's a question mark. Where would we want to go with the biosphere? We don't have a million options. We're not living on this planet where everything is natural except for a few little places, and then we could just save everything. We're living on a planet that's already largely transformed by human use in one way or another. And we're also living on a planet where we have set the climate system in motion at a very rapid rate, right? Species have to move as their biomes, as the places they're adapted to are moving with the climate system. And so we have set in motion this change. Species have to move. We have to be able to move with them and to help them move. And we have not made this easy. We have not thought about this and we have basically built infrastructure across the surface of the Earth that makes it very hard for other species to move. We've made great impediments for that. But the idea that humans are just making things difficult, are just kind of destroying the world, is not also the full story. And I think just about everyone here knows that this is Yosemite, and probably most of you know that there's actually another valley that used to look almost exactly like that, that is now a reservoir for the city of San Francisco, Hetchy Hetchy. And that was a decision, right? This could be a reservoir too. It's not. It was decided that this would be something else. So land use decisions aren't just about taking things and turning them into parking lots. There's a lot of different forms of decision that can be made. And even some of the ecological capacities of landscapes can be restored. The idea that everything is just about denuding and destroying when it comes to humans is not accurate at all. We've actually gotten much better at figuring out ways that that you can transform landscapes back to allow them to be more functional for other species. It's not just about humans. Humans, though, and other species, if we want to make the world better for both of us, there's a lot of challenges when these two things come together, right? The lose-lose situation where trying to do two things in the same place. Let's conserve habitat for wild species and advance the needs of society can be a problem. So it's not a trivial challenge. But we have learned to be smarter. We have new ways of building our infrastructure that can actually enable the coexistence of different types of movements in the landscape, the non-human and the human. It's very possible, and actually in parts of Canada, this is required by law. You build a highway, you need to build transport for the other species as well. We do need to think pretty big about this because, again, we're setting in motion the movement of species across continents. We have to provide access across continents for that to happen. The good news is that nature is not weak and fragile. Nature is strong, and it is ready to come back whenever it's given the chance, and even sometimes when it's not. Species are adapting to these environments. This is an example of crows using just built infrastructure as a nesting platform. The smarter species, the ones with bigger brains, actually tend to be doing better. So that's an interesting, just a general trend. The wolf is coming back. The wolf is a dangerous animal. A lot of people are scared of wolves for good reasons. They will eat your pets, and so it's a hard animal to live with. So it's actually a remarkable success that we're able to bring back this dangerous megafauna into some of the most densely populated areas of Europe. Right? We can bring species back that have been gone for a long time. We can rewild. We can even bring back species that have been gone for very, very long periods of time and change ecology back. So it's not a one-way street. It's not a one-directional future that we're looking at. There's a lot of options. We need to think, of course, about the human space as well, and a lot of it has been something like this. And it could be better planned. It could be more equal. It could be a better space. And we do know some things about this that we can apply. We know that dense cities are much more energy efficient. For example, if we want to use less energy, we can build denser cities. And we know that we're going to have to adapt to coastal areas that are going to be inundated by global warming. But when we do these adaptations, the kind of classic tendency to just build something hard and gray, ooh, what happened there? There it is. To build something hard and gray is not the only way to do this. There are other, that just disappeared. Interesting. All right, what you would have seen there is a picture of essentially green infrastructure in the coastal area. So building smart green infrastructure to replace some of the functions that we need to deal with coastal issues is something that we have an option to do. We can think differently. We can completely rethink the city. It doesn't actually have to be just the way it has been in the past. There's a lot of new options for things. And we need to change our vision for what our role is on the planet. So the classic view, at least of ecologists and a lot of conservationists, is this idea that we have this kind of wild nature out there that's just being disturbed and hammered on by humans just recently, and that we just need to stop that. That is what we'll do to make the world better. And think in terms of, the fact is we have transformed most of the earth already. And so it's more a matter of what are we going to do better in the future? How are we going to conserve nature within human societies rather than try and keep it outside? Because everything's more or less embedded. We need to change the way we teach and think about the Earth system to incorporate the human system as a fundamental part. And even with our individual selves, we've learned that we are not 100% human. We are part microbiome, and that microbiome is exchanging across all of us. It's part of our built infrastructure. It's part of what we eat. It's part of the environment we live in. We're all actually biologically and physically connected with each other. Thank you. A little bit over.
Take a seat here.
Sure.
And, what I'm
Any
going to do,
particular position? Just here?
yeah, anywhere. No, we'll do that later. Thank you. And so now it's time to go to responses by OU faculty. Let me pull on down. So first I'm going to invite up Lynn Sorgan from the geology department. What I'm going to do is invite the faculty responders to come on up. I've got a kind of gist of their questions on the slide, and I'll talk for just a couple minutes to contextualize that.
All right. So Earl, your paper addresses, that's the brief version. I'll just take a couple of minutes here. Your paper addresses really what sets humans apart from all other life on Earth, which is really an amazing concept to address. And you propose the ultimate causes of human transformation of the biosphere are inherently social and cultural. So I'm coming from the natural sciences, and I view theories as ideas that generate predictive and falsifiable hypotheses. So I'm wondering if our culture shapes our niche construction, what does the future hold for humans and the Earth system? And you addressed some of that in your talk here, but I specifically want to focus it a bit more. So in one of my blog postings, I drew upon kind of the history of development of communications. You mentioned in your paper language and technology are two of the facets of humans that really set us apart, and our ultra-sociality in particular. So, we've advanced from isolated cave paintings to tweeting, and global communications, instantly and globally. So does consideration of communication technology and how that has expanded and exploded globally lead to predictable and falsifiable hypotheses about the trajectory of anthropogenic ecological change?
So I'm supposed to answer that question.
Why don't we wait? We'll hear from all four of our colleagues and who will join us up on stage, and then I'll give you a chance to respond.
Yeah, if you can cue them.
Yeah.
By the time I'm done.
Yeah, there we go. This will give you time to think about your responses. Let me call up Steve Ellis of the philosophy department.
Thanks a lot, Earl. I want to say that I find this stuff fascinating, and I hope, in a certain sense, to make room for more sort of socio-cultural insights, if that's a possible thing. So I noticed that, in general, the notion of culture gets represented in your account by way of sort of structures and mechanisms, things like material products, hierarchical relations, social learning, information exchange, and those sorts of things. But as a philosopher who's interested in decision-making, my interest in culture is from the inside, so to speak, and I think we experience our cultures in certain kinds of ways, and that's very motivating to us. So you might think of that as a kind of ideological perspective. So I want to sort of push you on the importance of ideology, the way cultures think about themselves. So it seems that humans, unlike a lot of our other broadly cultural species, have this capacity to reflect on what they do. We have meetings like this, for example. And given that that's the way that we engage with our planning for the future and that sort of thing, I wonder whether or not the sort of rethinking that you were talking about at the end of your paper requires that we pay attention to these more internal notions of culture that talk about how we understand what we're doing, how we, the actual processes by which we plan, for example. Those seem to be elements of culture, or at least the capacity that we have to internally represent things to ourselves. is part of culture. So I hope we can talk a little bit about the role of that sort of thing in the sociocultural niche construction.
Thanks, Stephen.
Can't even get through here.
Yeah. And next, I'd like to invite up Asa Randall from the Anthropology Department.
I'm an anthropologist and an archaeologist. I'm very much interested in long-term social and ecological dynamics. And I think my question is something that is kind of aligned with what Steve was addressing there. In your configuration of the long-term entrainment, I guess, of humans as a species in the broader environment, you use two related but slightly different versions of change through time. One of them is a kind of an evolutionary model. And then another one is a cultural evolutionary model that is stadial, in that you go from state one being hunter-gatherer, state two being horticulturalists, and on and on and on and on. But there are other ways of talking about change through time as well. So we could actually talk about actual history, right? And we could break that down into history being the contingent sequence of events, which has its own explanatory power. And also we could talk about history in terms of the ways in which people recognize their place in the world. So history being what people make of their own past. And I think I'm just curious as to whether or not we can actually incorporate those actual histories as opposed to these idealized stages, right? And if we might get a sense for greater complexity. So.
Thanks. And the last of our bloggers I'd like to invite up is Kaisa Gates, who's with the Biological Survey.
Great, thank you, Earl. My question comes from a perspective of management, and you describe a path forward in the anthropogenic biosphere where we need to shift our conservation priorities from those of preserving nature to sustaining. And I think that the city example is a great example of how we can intensify our land use and our efficiency and thereby protect places where we don't have dense aggregations of people. But as somebody who works at the intersection of management, natural resource management, and science, I am acutely aware of the lack of connection sometimes between science and policy, and how those two things should really influence one another, but typically it's not a reciprocal relationship. So my question for you, well, one of the things that's been more difficult for me in engaging in the policy process is finding consensus in a way that you can actually develop policy that lays the groundwork for effective management actions. And so I'd like to know what your policy implications potentially are, and then more broadly, how can we develop consensus among managers, policymakers, and scientists on this idea of becoming sustainers of nature?
Thank you, Kaisa. So here are the sort of the gist of the questions that we've just heard, and maybe we'll give Earl just a few minutes to respond sort of broadly to these very small, minor points that we've just raised. And while he's doing that, I'm going to start taking a look at the tweets that have been coming in and pick out some questions that we can talk about from you folks. And we've got a mic too, so we can do it the old-fashioned way. So Earl, do you want to respond?
All right. Well, yeah.
There's a mic there if you want to.
Yeah, well, thank you for some great questions and for making them even more complex in the last few minutes. So you've definitely got me thinking deeply and hard. And the first one, the first set of questions are, the most important questions you should ask of any hypothesis or theory, right? Where's the evidence? Where, as they were saying in the room, but more broadly, right? Where's the beef for the theory? So now it is very grandiose to try to compare yourself with Darwin, but I did take that kind of thinking about the development of the theory in that just through the explanation of the theory, the evidence is part of it. And so what I'm looking for with sociocultural niche construction theory is two things. One is, and I'm kind of working back from the data in a certain sense. One is, humans have transformed the Earth. I think the evidence for that is really good. And so the fact that other species have not done that demands some kind of unusual explanation. There needs to be some theory for why humans would do that and other species haven't. And so I have a theory that can, in principle, explain this. And the other is why humans do so many different things with the environment, essentially why our niche is so diverse. Why is it that you can't say what people do? How do people make a living? It's so socially determined that there isn't any simple way to describe it. It's very diverse, and it has changed a lot over time. It's dynamic, and in fact, it can be changed even within one individual. Other species really can't match that. Also, of course, the scale of societies, why the scale of societies has changed. And so all those things are evidence for this idea that we need, in a sense, an evolving capacity for behavior that is different than that of other species. So that's more or less my evidence. But I agree, there's a little bit of this just so story kind of problem with it because, if there was competing theories explaining this, it would be a little easier. And I haven't got a whole lot of competing theories, I'll just admit it, because that big picture narrative is generally like humans are stupid, humans are destroyers, humans just do all this crazy stuff. There's not a whole lot of good explanations why humans do so many different things like this that I'm familiar with. Anyway, so that would be my kind of general term there. There was another add-on that you added to it that I thought I should respond to too, that I liked.
It was specific to our capacity of communication.
Right. Yeah, and I think that, and I kind of don't like all the hyping of the internet because it really is very hyped. And so more hyping isn't really good when you're already hyping things. On the other hand, you have to look at it if the theory, as I presented, is about ultrasociality, which is this ability for humans to essentially cooperate at levels and communicate at levels that no other species can do it. The fact that we now have real-time communication across the Earth is really a remarkable capacity. What other organism can communicate across the Earth in real time? I mean, it's an extraordinary capacity, and it's extraordinary in human history too. And so you could expect that societies will change in some way as a result, and that change in society will also have environmental consequences. Those are the predictions, but that's obviously not very detailed, and it's almost like just hyping in a way because I'm not saying exactly what would happen. But you would expect things to change significantly, and I think you would also argue that the changes that we've seen so far are only a minor part of that. As long as this kind of infrastructure to do this kind of communication continues, there's the potential to have really unexpected levels of change, the dramatic levels of change. So I would add that on and say that is an implication. All right, so on to the difference between the external, right. So this is the one about the internal experience of culture versus kind of culture as it just plays out. And from my theoretical point of view, the most important element of looking at cross generations at cultural change, because that's really the level of this kind of human climate change, not the human weather change, the dynamics within our daily lives and our yearly politics and all that. That's very powerful, but it's not explained by my theory. I don't intend to be able to explain that. It's the long-term trends. These very large-scale trends are the ones I'm looking at. In that case, and it's another way I describe the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene happened while we were busy making other plans. Right? Nobody wanted the Anthropocene. It wasn't like a strategy. No, it wasn't an idea that we should have an Anthropocene. Right? It just kind of happened. And that is a pretty important part of why humans have changed things so much, is because we've kind of gotten away with it just the societies play out and they have these consequences, and that's just good enough. So the degree to which there's this very conscious form of change and deliberation is at the scale across generations. It's debatable how much of that there is, and arguably there might be very little conscious shaping of cross-generational changes in social environmental relations. At that level of change, it's not planned, it's not discussed almost, like what should happen in the next 100 years. There's a little bit of that, go west. That was 100 years or so of thinking about a strategy. But I'm not so convinced that there's a whole lot of it at that very long-term scale. On a daily level, we're constantly telling ourselves stories because it's how we're social creatures. In order for us to believe anything, we have to believe it with others to some degree. It's not enough just to have your own ideas. You have to kind of reinforce. And so that's a central part of just sociality and social learning. And we learn, our perspectives from each other and all this sort of thing to some degree. So I think it's extremely important as part of the process of sociality, but I'm not sure how important it is in terms of guiding long-term change. So that would be my take on that. It's a little bit, I'm actually giving you a kind of shallow response because I'm saying I almost don't think, I'm not so sure how valuable it is. All right, and then incorporate actual history. All right, so actually with that one, it's kind of funny, is actually, I've got a paper on that because, and it's maybe not the kind of actual history that you're thinking about, but I've done a lot of work on historical reconstructions of human transformation of land. How at different time periods, how people done it. And that's mostly been from models because we don't have a great empirical global data set for what's happening on Earth at different times everywhere. But that is something that does exist to some degree. The paleoecologists have records of how vegetation has changed in different places over very long term, from pollen records and this sort of thing. And archaeologists have long-term time slices of social and environmental change in different places. And so it's one of my big interests. It's a big project, really a monumental, huge project, bigger than me, much bigger than me, is the idea of doing this kind of global reconstruction of trajectories of change all over the world. And if we're going to have a deeper understanding of, even what came here before, we need that. And it's very obvious that, and ecology is really guilty of this, is this nowism where, people show up at a place and they're just like, oh, well, look, there's forest here, so this is a forested place. When in fact, historically there have been many, many changes. Some of them anthropogenic, some of them just natural shifts in things. The world has been very dynamic for a very long time, and it actually does matter. That what came before matters. And natural history, strangely enough, the term natural history implies kind of you're not thinking about humans, but in reality, natural history does a lot of stuff with cultural changes in landscapes, and this sort of thing is very normal for them to talk about. So bringing natural history in is very important. So if you want to understand trajectories and dynamics of social ecological change in a place, which is important. If you sum that up, it is the global change. I think that's really important. It's kind of like one of my next projects in a way, but it's a really long-term project. That doesn't get at all of that, but that gets at part of that idea. And then the last one here with conservation policy. So I think that one of the things that is being learned is that there's lots of different ways to succeed and fail with conservation strategies. And so, one-size-fits-all strategies are probably not a good idea. And having one narrative for why you should conserve things and why we should all get together to work on something like a project, like conserving something, it's not, like my messaging isn't going to be the only one that works or something like that. But I think and related ones, I'm not the only person with these kinds of new narratives about conservation. Emma Maris is another example of somebody with a new conservation narrative. I think the idea of, instead of focusing on the problem as being some bad people who are doing all this destructive harm as being the strategy for dealing with harmful environmental change, but rather focusing on what the stakeholders and communities involved, the people who actually serve to benefit or lose in the context of conservation efforts, see themselves as, in a sense, with the powers they actually have. Like the story can change. And so it's up to us, it's up to everyone involved to change things in the direction that people actually want, to actually engage in making things better rather than avoiding things getting worse, right? It seems kind of simple. It's like the half full, half empty kind of narrative difference. But I think it's really important to think in terms of not just focusing on the negatives, but really focusing on the positives. Like, this place could really conserve a lot more species. It could be a lot more fun to enjoy this place. Why aren't we working on that together? Is I think a more engaging strategy than just like, how are we going to stop the bad developers from developing things? That's kind of what I see as kind of one of these changes with, you know, changing the idea of sustainers to sustainers from destroyers. I think there's an advantage there. But maybe there's the occasional time when the most effective strategy is just to find the villain and attack them. That's a possibility. But I think it has failed in a lot of cases. I mean, with Peter Kareva, who's taken a lot of heat for his kind of working with developers, like, for example, working with dam projects to make them less harmful rather than just opposing them. There's a lot of cases where those dams are going to get built. There's a certain number of dams that are going to get built. And you could either be the group that just opposes every single dam and ends up being an outsider in the game, versus bringing the expertise of conservationists into the dam projects to make them better dam projects, and restricting the projects to the ones that are the better ones, rather than, you know, fight the ones that are really the worst, but then also try to help the ones that could be the better ones. So it's instead of this kind of all or nothing, stop the humans from developing strategy, it's a more proactive strategy, engagement strategy. All right, there's probably not too brief, but.
No, that's great. So I'm going to see if we can make this a truly 21st century event here by engaging the very active Twitter stream that we've been, I've had the chance to take a look at. So here's what's been going on, and I'm not, this may be a little behind here, as this is just a bunch of the tweets that have come out here. And I'm waiting for a couple that I wanted to pull up. And hold on just a second. It's coming on. Actually, there was one that I wanted to pull up, but I'm going to, from one of our student members of the audience, but while that one is coming on down, I'm going to turn to this one, which is from someone who has been a member of our blog, but who has not participated in this project, but that's Noah Terrio, who's in the room. I'm showing it. Do you want to just talk about the idea behind your question here?
Sure. Thanks, Ed. I was just curious about how do we measure what would be an improvement in the Earth system, and who gets to define that, sort of, so whose lives are improving, and who could be humans or non-humans?
Yeah, that's you know. The funny thing about that question is that I've been discussing that a lot with my graduate student, my new graduate student. He's just in his first year, so he's definitely taking on very, very big ideas. He'll learn, he'll become very narrow and disciplinary soon enough, but for now, he's interested in questions like that. Well, he actually started off with the idea, well, we'll just optimize. We'll just do an optimization, and then we'll know the answer. And when I heard that, I had to, no, it's not. It's never going to be that simple. But from my point of view, like you said, the question is who is the bigger question, and I think conservation has already learned this the hard way. Is a democratic process, is trying to bring in kinds of democratic process, not like American democracy, but processes in which the people who have consequences from these things are involved in the decision making, is a way of trying to have the better strategies kind of rise to the top. But it can be very, very hard, because there are situations, many situations where you truly have a wicked problem where there's going to be winners and losers, period. And maybe the only good thing that can come out of some of that democratic process is making it really clear that that's going on, rather than kind of putting it in the background somewhere where nobody sees the fact that some people are winning and other people are losing in a particular decision process. But I don't expect, in some ways, it sounds very convenient just to say, well, it's just a social process. It's easy. Well, it's just a social process. Well, social processes are really, really complicated, and it doesn't make it any easier to say that, making the Earth better is a social process. It's a hard process. And it's no easier than anything we've got going on right now. So it doesn't simplify or make things easier to say that humans can improve things, just like we could say we can improve societies. And you could argue that human societies in general have gained a lot of improvements, right? We don't have slavery anymore, right? There are actually some real improvements that have occurred over time in social conditions. So it is possible for things to improve. They have improved to some degree, so more improvement is possible. But it's never simple. It's never without a struggle, this sort of thing. But how do you measure it? It's like everyone's going to use a different yardstick. I don't think it's a simple process if there's one, optimizing factor or something like that.
There was a question that I wanted to pull up. I'm looking for it here. I have to say this is a little bit experimental for me, so hold on while I try and do this. Actually, I might just revert to the old-fashioned ways. Carlos here? Who's Carlos? Carlos, you asked a couple questions about social learning and also about the kind of cyberspace internet technology. I was looking for that tweet, but maybe I'll just ask you to talk about them a little bit. There's a mic there if you want.
Sorry. Thanks.
Sure. My question has to do more with a little bit related to the communication, how we use communication in order to improve policy or get to that agreement on policy. And we see our previous generation, and especially now I consider myself as a millennial, and my question for you is, have you seen anything different among millennials now that we're taking pretty much over charge and policy influencing kind of factors? Have you seen any difference with the millennials culture that you haven't seen before as now in order to see or measuring these type of factors of affecting the Anthropocene? So can we do anything about it, or have you seen anything that we haven't seen before in previous generations?
Yeah, that's a superb question. I'll throw out that I think other people here should answer that as well. But I would say that what I have seen is that millennials do seem to take to this kind of messaging where there is a let's make the world better kind of messaging. And I mean, I grew up at the tail end of, I'm kind of a tail end of the baby boom where Jimmy Carter runs into Ronald Reagan. And so there's a lot of diminished expectations. We went through Watergate and all that sort of thing. People, just surviving the world seemed like a good strategy, and there wasn't like greater ambitions. But I think there's a feeling among millennials is that we can change the world for the better. Why not? Why don't we just do this? And almost as if it might not be that hard. They haven't, seen necessarily all the worst kind of conflicts come into play with these things, so they're somewhat optimistic about the possibilities. That's been my experience, but I'm curious about other experiences with millennials.
Well, I'll just say one thing that I think you're right. The positive messaging is really good. One of the things I struggle with as a professor is to get across the science, for example, the science of climate change, without depressing everybody, because you've got to, you've got to come out with a message of hope. And so I think that really everybody relates better to hope than to sort of whipping, right?
And I would just point out that taking a kind of the long-term perspective, that millennial or not, messaging is incredibly important. And actually, I just urge you to be a little bit more open to the idea that these like long-term social processes can actually be something that's active, right? So social memories, stories, narratives, right? They're part of ecology from a human perspective, right? And they're ways of putting the brakes, if you will, on the runaway effects, right? So they're ways of kind of persisting even in the face of change at times. And I kind of hope that that's something that we could think about now in terms of our messaging is to be, as you say, Lynn, positive, but know that it's something that we need to engage in now and often. So.
I think it's also just worthy of note that people respond to, by and large, to sort of messaging that they're comfortable with. I mean, you rarely see societies, cultures, even across generations, sort of make very radical sort of cognitive shifts anyway. There's a Marx quote about this. It's actually kind of funny. Every revolution sort of apes the last revolution. It's all great world historical events happen twice. The first time is a tragedy. The second time is a farce. And the discussion goes on to talk about how, the French revolutionaries dressed up in Roman garb because that's who they were explicitly sort of aping in a certain kind of way. So there's a real evolutionary aspect to this, and the fact that people look back for cultural exemplars, and I think that's an important part of the framing, except you need to make sure that you're adapting it to the new facts, right? I mean, part of the Marx story there is that we're comfortable in thinking in certain kinds of ways, but we're actually thinking about new stuff, so we need to get the new elements in there as well. So there's a lot of complexities when you sort of look at it from the inside again.
Steve, is that sort of, are you speaking about the idea of fighting the last war?
In a certain sense, yes, but I mean, we always have that in our minds. Yeah, so we have it in our minds, sort of worrying about the way in which other people have handled analogous problems in the past. So we look for exemplars from the past, even as we're sort of groping to deal with new things.
Is this the dynamic at work, Earl, when you sort of put up the kind of traditional conservation picture of, hands off and leave it alone? That's sort of like the last war, and we shouldn't be going into the current, confront current conservation problems with that older mindset. We really need to kind of open our eyes to actual conditions or current conditions and fight the new war with new ideas. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah. Well, for conservation, this is actually this is not just a kind of difference in narratives. It's actually a practical situation, right? So if your strategy in the past has been, let's keep negative human societal influences from damaging a place that otherwise would be fine. We'll just sit there and be perfect without us. That is a kind of a classic way to do conservation. But when you have a planet that's really rapidly changing, so species have to move, you have to actually very actively monitor change and engage with change, and maybe even facilitate change, actually move species from one place to another in order to conserve them, rather than keep them in one place to conserve them. It's a real problem when your narrative is just stop the brake, put the brakes on, when in fact you actually have to engage more to do conservation. You actually have to, sustain more. Just keeping hands off is a bad strategy. It's a strategy that will fail. And even when you do legal issues with that, for example, this species is native in this park and it must stay here. And any species that's not native in this park right now is an invader, and we will spend lots of money on herbicide to get rid of it. When those species come up from the south, as they will and as they are coming up, you end up spending all your money on herbicide, and it's a guaranteed fail. So the strategies for changing planet are different than the strategies for a planet that doesn't change. And so it's not just a narrative discussion. It's also a practical, strategic discussion, I think.
We can take questions the old-fashioned way, and I'm blanking on your name. I'm having one of those moments. When? I was going to say when. Honestly, I was. So when the mic is coming up, and you can use that.
Thank you for your talk. I'm interested in the methodological question. So, your theory is a theory that tries to explain in a very large scale the I don't know how to put it, the difference between human being and other species and how human beings have made changes to where we are. I followed technology, and so the question is this: with such a large scale perspective, how do you take into account the current changes? In the discussion of people like the futurists, they have talked about how the development of technology has not only accelerated, but the rate of acceleration also accelerates. So there's a double acceleration in a sense. And so I wondered, I'm not quite sure how that, like where we will go, but this kind of drastic sense of change seems a little unfitting into this your large scale perspective. So I just wonder, how do you handle, let's say, the current developmental trend, if that question makes sense?
Singularity
That's part of what I have in mind, yes.
and transhumanism and all this stuff. So there's no question. So I've already brought up the idea that at least with internet and some of these other technologies too, autonomous, thinking machines are also transforming things. There's a lot of different things that are transforming biotechnology. That are really transformative things. We can change ourselves biologically with genetic tools. There's amazing potentials coming up. So that, and I've looked at the Singularity book. I haven't completely read it from cover to cover, but I feel like it's kind of oversold. And I think one thing that is really important to realize is that most future predictions are heinously wrong. Almost all of them. Everyone has been talking about flying cars forever, and there's still no flying cars. There's lots of examples where kind of our aspirational futures don't come true. And there's a lot of momentum in society for things not changing too. So I think I expect there to be really radical transformative changes within my lifetime. Most of them very strange that I wouldn't anticipate. And also, I think the other important element about them is that they might not feel like big changes when they happen. They will happen in ways that seem kind of unremarkable. Like internet happened to us. Most of it was kind of unremarkable. There was times when you really realized, whoa, I'm addicted to email. My God, I can't even communicate without email anymore. You realize that. But it took many years for that to happen before you really felt that way. And I think a lot of things are going to be like that. I don't know. I don't buy the idea that everything is going to completely turn to gray goo in 50 years, that everything we know is wrong in 50 years. That level of singularity prediction, I'm not convinced by. Like artificial intelligence probably won't become that transformative that fast. It'll be gradual and roll out in different ways that are kind of unexpected, but not, everything changes at once, is my thinking about it. But, I expect to be surprised in many different ways as well. I don't expect to have a predictable future.
I would only add that this brings up this really troubling thing. If you're an archaeologist, you have to worry about these sorts of things, because it's, is my job viable, or is it worthwhile to be thinking about the past when there's this apparent acceleration, right? So as Lynn has pointed out, that the rate and the pace of change is something that that the Earth hasn't seen ever. Certainly humans haven't, but at least in terms of the pace of climate change. And so, the past isn't necessarily a predictor, and we can ask these questions about whether or not we're actually at this rupture point. But we should also hope that at least perhaps in the past, folks have had these same kinds of moments of recognition of change. And even if they couldn't predict exactly what was going to happen, they also have made strategic decisions. But we are in a weird place. I was just at a conference last week where there's a huge debate. Right? The debate in Florida used to be, what do we do with the Everglades, right? Which are, do we restore them? And if we restore them, when do we restore them to? Is it AD 1500? Is it AD 5000 or BC? But now we're just wondering whether or not we should even bother trying to save them because they're going to be gone. And so, how do these are, I think, some of the questions that Noah is getting at as well. It's like, what actually are you going to, save? Do we want to create a nugget of that for the future? Anyways, I don't know. Again, you go from happy to sad, right? So I think Bill Belay called the Anthropocene a mood, and so.
Let's shift from talking about the future to talking about the past, and I'm going to pull up a tweet here by someone who's in the room, Jim Ziegler, who's been one of our bloggers. I'm going to show it, and you can tell it.
That's like my third tweet ever, and I don't think I need a mic because I'm a big voice, but Dr. Ellis and I already had just talked about this today. So I don't want to ask you to bog down the administrative details of the various groups that are communicating this. I'm more interested in the way that your reluctance to see a mid-20th century date for the Anthropocene kind of connects to some of, sorry, choked up. Like your essay concludes with a kind of call for pedagogy, and I get the impression that a mid-20th century fixed date for the Anthropocene for you is a bad pedagogy. It steers us away from understanding socio-cultural niche construction into some of the ways that you formulate it. So I just wanted to hear sort of more about that. And why go
I'm
on?
tempted to talk. So I'm working on a paper with an anthropologist at Stanford. I'll just say what the title is going to be about the Anthropocene divide. So the whole process of dating the Anthropocene to a very particular time, any particular time, implies automatically, at least to stratigraphers, that there's a before and then an after. So you're in the Anthropocene or you're not. And as you notice, right, the whole discussion, the whole process that I'm talking about is a process. And it's a complicated process. It unfolds over time. There's not a very precise time increment anywhere there. There's a lot of processes of becoming a global force, and it's still undergoing all these changes. So the idea of drawing a line can be a problem for that. And the more recent one, in some ways, is even more problematic because you're just looking at the very most recent changes, and essentially you'd be saying all the ones before that don't really count. They're not really part of the Anthropocene. What's the Anthropocene is what happens after that time. So I find if you're trying to understand, humans as a global force as a process, rather than just trying to say the Earth changes at time whatever, I'm a little more focused on that. So I think it's the less interesting question, I guess is what it is. But from a utilitarian point of view, with anything that's accelerating as a force, the most recent time you have more data, you have more change, you have more evidence to work with. And so for stratigraphers who are just concerned about having some evidence, it's easy. So yeah, sure, the more recent one is the one that you can guarantee will have enough data. And the early Anthropocene, say the earlier ones of say origins of agriculture, it's really pretty poor for consistent data. There's definitely data all over the place, but it's not a simple, consistent line in the sand kind of data. So it doesn't appeal to the stratigraphers at all.
I think we've got probably time for one more question. I saw Ariel's hand there. Maybe you can take the mic and close us out with a question.
Okay, thanks for your talk. It was really fascinating. I guess my question has to do with kind of an idea of how we can integrate these sorts of levels of global cooperation with seeing ourselves as integrated in the environment versus outside of it. I think that this might particularly raise tensions when we're thinking about economies in developing worlds and how it might be in some countries' interest to not necessarily try to develop around the environment and see themselves as integrated in it. It might actually be to the benefit of both these sort of developed economies and developing economies to say, no, we're separate from the environment, and this is easier for us, and we can cause some kind of economic boom and economic development, not only for ourselves, but for developing sort of economies. Does that make sense? So I guess I'm looking for, if you can, how we can get some kind of cooperation versus this sort of, well, this has been working for us, and it's in our interest to keep doing this. I mean, it has been working to some extent. It's made us more of a sort of world power, but we also seem to be helping, in a certain sense, developing countries in a way. Well, some people might say that.
So maybe what I'm guessing, I think what you're saying is that basically the idea that human activity can go on without concern for the environment, essentially it's a separate story. It doesn't need to be a common Earth system story. I would call that business as usual. Honestly, I think historically that's the way societies have gone about their business, and a lot of disciplines have too, where you can just treat the human story as being a human story, and then an environmental story is another story, two different things, and you don't have to think about them together. And the Anthropocene idea challenges us to say that they're not actually separated anymore, at least, and that we think about them together. But what does that do to, in a sense, the world order of not thinking about that? And that's a great question that a lot of people are talking about. Earth system governance. There's actually a whole project that just is studying Earth system governance, and they deal with issues about inequality and the question when we talk about what should we do and what are we doing to the planet. People are doing very many different things to the planet. Some people are having very small effects, and some people are having really huge effects. And it doesn't make anything any simpler to put everyone in the same. Everyone is influencing the planet. My hope is that what it does is by doing that, by saying we're all hooked up together in this planet, and it is true that we're not all enjoying the benefits equally, and we're not all changing the Earth equally. It doesn't make things any simpler, but hopefully it could enable the environmental consequences to become part of decision making on a normative basis, rather than just kind of tacked on at the end. Oh well, we need an environmental policy too, but rather than basically the future of the Earth is entwined with the decisions that we make at national level, individual level. They're all connected. I think making that the norm has the potential to be better. But of course, human societies are pretty good at fighting with each other about these things. For good reason. There are winners and losers. There's reasons to fight over a lot of these things. People benefit or lose from it. And that is not changed by that narrative. It's not like all of a sudden, it's like, oh, we're all in it together, so we're all going to be one big happy family. That's not the same thing. So I don't think it necessarily makes it any easier, but I think it has the potential to guide outcomes a little bit better with respect to the environment, at least.
Any final comments from the panel? Well, I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. If you have been tweeting and want to be considered for this prize that we talked about and you didn't register, be sure to visit with Madison on your way out to get a form out at the table where you came in. And otherwise, won't you join me in saying thank you to all of our panel and to Earl Ellis for coming and joining us.